ash, bone and sickle, bleeding saints and forest witches, the past unburied, the books unsealed, the old celebration returning.
Hello, and welcome to my study. Please come in and have a seat. All the books surrounding you are those used to research our show, and the individual to my right here, along with managing domestic duties, serves as our reader for any passages that will be directly quoted from these sources. Her name is Mrs. Carswell.
Hello.
I should start with a bit of an apology and explanation, I suppose. This show was supposed to be out in July, but it turned into an August show. The good part of this is that you have a show in August when I'd planned a month's vacation.
Or this could be the show. Half for July and half August.
I guess so. Anyway, August is the last month before September, October, that slide into Halloween. Then we have the dark Christmas season. And all those months, we like to have lots of content and little extras. So I take a month off to gear up for all that.
For things like trick or treat by mail. Aren't we doing that for listeners again?
Yes, virtual trick-or-treating with us via the postal service. For those who haven't already done so, you can sign up for that on our Patreon page, and it wouldn't be a bad idea to do that sooner rather than later, as I may put a cap on it this year. It ended up taking a bit more time than I expected last year.
I hope you have time for all that with your vacation, or whatever you're going to be doing that involves moving stuff around in the basement all day.
Just getting everything ready.
And stocking the cabinets and fridge down there. You made it sound like you're spending a month underground.
It's kind of an experiment. I won't be down there the whole time.
That's good.
You may not see me upstairs, but that doesn't mean I'm trapped. There's that Bilko door, so I can go in and out. You just might not see me.
Oh, I would get claustrophobic.
Oh, it's really quite expansive down there. It's the entire footprint of the house. You've only seen part of it because it's blocked off. It's deep. Very deep.
Okay, well, I'm sure you know what you're doing. Oh, and you got that package you've been worrying about.
And you're only telling me now?
It literally just happened. A courier dropped it off. He said he was a bike courier, but there was no bike.
What difference does that make? And why would he announce he's a bike courier?
People don't do that. It's strange. And he was wearing a suit.
It is possible to ride a bike in a suit.
But unusual.
Yes. Let's move on to our Patreon segment. Our thank you for the new supporters. You have the names, and I have the jingle here.
Thank you to our friends who listen to the show.
Sharing in our travels through tales of long ago.
Stories full of folklore.
Stories full of horror.
If you give us money, we will like you more.
And our heroes of the day are...
I'll read them, but hearing those voices, I do want to say I'm still waiting for a response from the twins. If you're listening out there...
They're not twins.
I'm speaking to you, Julie, David. If you're listening, ask your father if he's seen the email I sent. Mr. Ridenauer shared his email so I could write you, but maybe he missed the message. It's for both of you.
Can we get the names of our supporters?
Yes, of course. They are Rodent of the Astro Waste, Rita, and Dave Baxter.
Okay, thank you. And again, we'll be back in September sometime. And now to our show, episode 131, Subterranean Sages and Russian Mystics. I am your host, Al Ridenour, and this show, Bone and Sickle, examines the intertwining of horror and folklore in a historical context. I started the show as a way to further explore this area of intersection after writing my book, The Krampus and the Old Dark Christmas, and will have a related volume out at the start of next year. Bone and Sickle only exists thanks to the generosity of our Patreon donors who choose from a tantalizing array of monthly rewards, including shirts, mugs, dusty old things from the library shelves here, and access to monthly bonus episodes. And I'll have more on all that at the end of our show.
Am Ende des Jahres erscheinen den Gläubigen noch einmal die furchtbaren Fratzen der Dämonen. Sie erinnern den Menschen.
You're listening to a bit of Geheimnis Tibet, Secret Tibet, a film documenting the findings of Nazi researchers visiting that country in 1938 through 39. The expedition was conducted under the auspices of the Reich's Department of Ahnenerbe, or Ancestral Heritage, an institute dedicated to supporting historical and scientific theories harmonizing with party doctrines. However, there's actually nothing overtly Nazi in the film. The narration emphasizes the Germans befriending Tibetans and even offering some rudimentary medical services. But there is an unsettling segment showing scientists making plaster life casts from the faces of the locals. And then there's a scene of a Tibetan weaver producing textiles featuring what the narrator calls
the age-old Indo-Aryan sign of the swastika.
Das uralte Indo-Arscheichen des Hakenkreuzes.
The Aryans of the Nazi imagination, not the actual Indo-Aryans or Indo-Iranians, to whom the term properly belongs, the Nazi Aryans were said to have come from the far north, but in their migration were largely believed to have deposited some sort of cultural legacy in India, the Himalayas, or Central Asia. The Eastern swastika was borrowed into the symbology of the Thule Society, and during World War I into Ariosophy, a movement dedicated to the study of this imaginary primal Aryan, which is intertwined with notions of German racial purity and anti-Semitism. But regarding the film, it should be noted that the expedition was undertaken in 1938, a year after Hitler had outlawed Theosophy, Freemasonry, and related occult groups. Not that this necessarily erased all Aryan mysticism from Germans' heads, but it might at least have dissuaded the filmmakers from making bold statements regarding the Tibetans and their Aryan heritage. While the German public was encouraged to focus on Aryans in their Nordic aspect, a scholarly fascination with Asian connections remained. Walter Wüst, the president of the Ahnenerbe from 1936 till its end, was a specialist in Sanskrit before his appointment, and during his tenure concerned himself with Indo-Aryan linguistics. Already in 1809, the poet and philosopher Friedrich von Schlegel, an important figure in German Romanticism and one of Europe's first Sanskrit scholars, proposed that ancient Sanskrit may have shaped European languages as far north as Scandinavia. But the Nazis would later reverse this with Asian cultures descending from the Nordic. Hermann Wirth, who led the Ahnenerbe before Wüst in his 1928 book, The Rise of Mankind, placed the origins of all humankind in supposedly once temperate Arctic regions. We've already seen this as a literary motif in our previous Hollow Earth episode, that is, unspoiled primal races emerging from the polar regions as forefathers to later self-corrupting surface dwellers. But the idea has also appeared in turn-of-the-century books, including American author William F. Warren's 1885 volume, Paradise Found, The Cradle of the Human Race at the North Pole, or Indian Home Rule advocate Bal Gangadhar Tilak's 1903 study, The Arctic Home of the Vedas. This far north homeland in the language of the Third Reich was called Thule. I'm using the German pronunciation. It's Thule, like the ski gear company. Not that they're Nazis. Anyway, the word appeared in antiquity, used by Virgil, for instance, to describe the northern edge of the world, or Ultima Thule, he called it, furthest Thule, probably a reference at the time to Scandinavia. And there was also a Thule Society in Munich prior to World War II, something you may have heard of if you've ever tuned into one of those History Channel occult Nazi shows in which most everything you hear is likely untrue. The Thule Society was first spun up into some sort of all-powerful occult brotherhood in a conspiracy book of the 1960s, the cult classic Morning of the Magicians. But in truth, the Thule Society was a nasty little anti-Semitic group dedicated to fighting local communists and safeguarding racial purity. A group already disbanded in 1925 after its enemy, the abortive Munich Soviet Republic, had collapsed 2 years earlier. Now, originally as a follow-up to our Hollow Earth episode, I'd considered looking at more Third Reich mythology, as it is related, including claims that there had been an underground Nazi base in Antarctica. But endless debunking makes for an unsatisfying show, I think, and frankly, I'm also sick of talk about Nazis generally. Anyway, you've been promised Russians, not Germans, and we're getting to that. An important concept to the Russians, one more or less equivalent to Thule and used more widely, that is beyond Russia, is Hyperborea. It's a Greek term used by Herodotus and others meaning beyond Boreas, the god of the north wind. It was imagined, despite its location in the extreme north, as a warm and fruitful land once populated by gigantic, incredibly long-lived Hyperboreans, favorites of Apollo, who also were said to have founded his shrine at Delphi. So, as in later myths, we have a godlike race superior to our own, emerging from the north. Now, another term that gets mixed up in all this is Agartha, understood as the name of an underground city or land serving as a repository of ancient wisdom. The word, or one of its many spellings and forms, first appeared in an 1871 book by the French travel writer Louis Jacquot, who, as his day job, worked as a lawyer in French colonies in India and Tahiti. While on the subcontinent, Jacquot developed some idiosyncratic notions, imagining Jesus in India as Krishna and finding the origin of Christianity, Judaism, and the Egyptian religion, as imagined in Freemasonry, in India. Some of this appeared in his book, Occult Science of India, written a few years before his 1871 book, The Son of God, in which Agartha, or Asgartha, as he spells it, appears. The book is a fanciful reimagining of Indian history, representing Asgartha as the spiritual capital of a lost 40,000-year-old Brahminic culture. Some scholars have suggested that his name, Asgartha, was borrowed from Norse mythology, the kingdom Asgard reworked to look a bit more Sanskrit-y. But it was another Frenchman who really fleshed out the concept of Agartha, moving it closer to its most common spelling, though he adds an extra T, and placing it underground in the east, probably under the Himalayas. Alexandre Saint-Yves' 1886 book, The Mission of India in Europe, is all about Agartha and will provide the link to Russia as it winds its way into our upcoming story of a prophecy-driven army battling Bolsheviks in Mongolia. Now, whether Saint-Yves read Jacques Oyot is unclear. His primary inspiration for his Agartha story seems to have been a Sanskrit tutor, probably an Afghan, who called himself Haji Sharif. In private handwritten lesson books prepared for Saint-Yves, there are references to Agartha. When citing his name to the workbook, Sharif even identified himself as a teacher
of the great Agarthian school.
The signature was followed by some strange calligraphic markings identified as the language of Agartha, Vatan, supposedly a common ancestor of Sanskrit and Hebrew. Saint-Yves' name was also transliterated into Vatan, which he had duplicated in Mission to India. There are some interesting theories about the true identity of Haji Sharif, which I'll address on our Patreon pages, but suffice it to say he was probably not from Agartha. Nor is he mentioned in Saint-Yves' book, the contents of which the author attributes to astral visits to the place and the observations of unnamed sources. So, what was Agartha like?
The Cyclopean metropolis opens, lit from below by a fluid red ocean that is a distant reflection of the central fire, which has withdrawn into itself during that time of the year. There is an infinite array of the strangest kinds of architecture, in which all minerals, commingled, achieve what the fancies and chimeras of the Gothic, Corinthian, Dorian, and Ionian artists would never have dared dream.
The people of Agartha are larger than us, and
their bones are quite elastic. These bones can bend and return to their original form like tendons. Although their bodies may appear weak, their muscular system is infinitely stronger than our own. It is impossible to take away anything they hold clenched in their fingers. Their ears, which are more open than our own, have double cavities that are separated by meridian strips of skin. Their tongues have a strange quality that is partially artificial. Due to a surgical operation, they are split from the tip to the root. This anatomical configuration allows them not only to articulate all the sounds of every language in the world, but to imitate the songs and cries of all animal species.
Saint-Yves describes immense libraries and the accumulation of untold wisdom by Agartha's sages.
Each one of these scholars performs his work in solitude, far from any visible light, beneath the cities, deserts, plains, or mountains. All things have been profoundly studied, from matters concerning the air, including the invisible essences that dwell there, to the electricity that develops there, in echoes, after having been formed in the bowels of the earth, to where it will eventually return. The physiological constitution of the planet and the cosmos are known down to their tiniest details, both physical and essential, both visible and invisible. Aerial fleets of dirigible balloons have carried observations to a degree that is wholly inaccessible to our current methods. Electric railroads made not of iron, but of tempered and malleable glass, crisscross the ancient empire. There is not an insect, not a plant, not a mineral, not even a drop of dew, whose dynamic properties have not been inventoried and made the subject of an incredible number of observations and experiments. But it is not only upon the living that countless experiments have been performed. The dead have been injected with substances, exercising a connecting effect, forming a median bond between them and the cosmic essence of their souls that have ascended into the heavens. The attraction of these souls has lifted up these cadavers to dizzying heights during the night before the very eyes of the sages.
It was not always so, however. Saint-Yves describes a sort of ancient war resulting from the pursuit of knowledge, a time when the Agarthians
fell into black magic, and with the help of certain distorted formulas, received from below some responses to the decrees they purported to dictate from above. A monstrous heap of ignorance and superstition, commingling Brahmists and Buddhists in the same hatred, this sect sculpted an enormous stone statue in certain gorges of the Himalayas. Its lower jaw was mobile and opened a mouth that was several meters in circumference over an internal conduit that led to a water-filled abyss. A hydraulic mechanism caused the mandible of this gulf to move. Its constructors were the members of this atrocious priesthood.
The scenario recalls somewhat the warring sects in Jacques Prehistory of India, and, as we heard in our previous stories of the Hollow Earth, unruly elements are ejected to the surface world. Saint-Yves describes the miracle men of India as an example of these.
The fakir, before performing his trick, is charged with ether in the temples, as if he were a veritable human electric battery. The primary cause for the majority of these phenomena is the celestial force we call ether.
Only about a quarter of the book is devoted to these sorts of descriptions of Agartha. The majority of the book, Saint-Yves dedicates to extolling the ruling principle of this world, something he calls synarchy, conjoining Greek roots for together and rule, i.e. harmonious rule. Descriptions of this range from the practical to the metaphysical. As in example of the first, Saint-Yves calls for the governments of earth to
unite together in this law ecclesiastical and secular teaching bodies, economic bodies, and judicial bodies.
He also suggests the French Revolution had been inspired by synarchy,
but sectarian and violent politicians bankrupted the nation's goodwill, which had specifically illuminated the feeling of universality.
Yet, synarchy is hierarchical rather than egalitarian. At the top is a godlike priest-king, sequestered in the inmost sanctum of the underground temple, the
sovereign pontiff,
who is served by a
Mahatma representing the universal soul, and the Mahaga, symbol of the complete physical organization of the cosmos.
Now, in happier times, synarchy had once been somehow
radiated
from within Agartha to maintain harmonious civilizations of the surface world. But the modern West woefully fought against this and therefore experiences the opposite of synarchy, anarchy. Only through the union of Europe and Asia via the principle of synarchy can modern man be saved, hence the title Mission of India in Europe. At the same time, Saint-Yves insists Agartha, specifically its location, cannot be revealed until surface dwellers open their hearts and minds to synarchy. A kind of a catch-22, if you ask me. Saint-Yves was so convinced of his own arguments that the book contains direct appeals or actual letters to Queen Victoria, Alexander III of Russia, and Pope Leo III. It's not clear if Saint-Yves' convictions in these matters had changed between the time of writing and the time of publication, but before copies could be distributed, he destroyed all but 2 copies of the book. It's likely he still believed the synarchic principles outlined, but realized that fantastic stories about a subterranean kingdom might undercut his arguments. Regardless, the remaining copies, which had come into the possession of fellow occultists, were reproduced, and the book was widely distributed a year after his death in 1909. And now, we'll finally turn to Russia during the Revolution. The early Soviet goal of engineering a new society and new man evolved from a sort of cosmic mindset, not discontinuous with the culture of the late imperial era. During the turbulent decades around the turn of the century, Russia was awash with esoteric teachers, prophets, visionaries, and faith healers. Artists and aristocrats were particularly attracted by such things, a notorious example being Empress Alexandra's faith in Rasputin. Even after the execution of the Romanovs, not all the utopias were Marxist, which is why a synarchic Neverland like Agartha would continue to have appeal. One such enthusiast was Ferdynand Ossendowski, a Polish writer, chemistry professor, and adventurer who served with the White Guard during the Russian Civil War. His 1922 best-selling book describes those years: Beasts, Men, and Gods, documents in a romanticized way skirmishes with the Red Army and the story of a warrior mystic drawn into the conflicts in Central Asia. Ossendowski's own writing makes clear his embrace of Saint-Yves, who, in his Mission of India, often focuses on this particular region, addressing Queen Victoria and Alexander III on the dangerous implications of the Great Game, that is, Britain and Russia's competition for Central Asian territories. In what the author imagines is the contemporary equivalent of this, the Reds versus the Whites, Ossendowski imagines the Whites sided with synarchy, Reds anarchy. As Ossendowski's White Russian and Pole comrades flee the Reds through Mongolia, he hears some interesting tales.
The old people on the shore of the river Amwil related to me an ancient legend to the effect that a certain Mongolian tribe, in their escape from the demands of Genghis Khan, had hid themselves in a subterranean country. Afterwards, a local showed me the smoking gate that serves as the entrance to the kingdom of Agartha. Through this gate, a hunter formerly entered into the kingdom, and after his return began to relate what he had seen there. The lamas cut out his tongue in order to prevent him from telling about the mystery of mysteries. When he arrived at old age, he came back to the entrance of this cave and disappeared into the subterranean kingdom, the memory of which had augmented and lightened his nomad heart.
But you can't cut out all the tongues, and Ossendowski devotes several pages to describing this inner world. Another lama tells him,
There, in palaces of wonderful crystal, live the invisible rulers of all pious people, the king of the world, who can speak with God as I speak with you.
As the text goes on, you begin to notice striking similarities to Saint-Yves' Agartha, perhaps not literal plagiarizing, but a very close retelling, so I won't be providing all those repetitive details. Now, while Ossendowski's book is significant for bringing Agartha into the modern world, an even more interesting aspect may be his description of the influence of ancient Buddhist myths and prophecies upon a rogue soldier, a German warlord fighting for Mongolian independence, Baron Roman Ungern von Sternberg. The Baron's story is like something out of Kipling or Conrad, unbelievable if it were not similarly documented by a number of contemporaries. As Ossendowski's group flees into Outer Mongolia, they began hearing strange tales about the Baron, a cavalry officer loosely allied with the Whites, who's fighting both Reds and the Chinese on behalf of the Mongolians. More precisely, the Baron's dream was to support the Bogd Khan, the third most important Lama of Tibetan Buddhism, who he imagined rebuilding the empire of Genghis Khan. Not by coincidence, Ungern claimed his descent through his Hungarian side from the great Khan. More immediately, his family was Baltic German, allowing him to lay claim to the heritage of the Teutonic Knights and their famously martial culture. He lived for war, despised the modern world, hated Jews whom he regarded as Bolsheviks, and also wished to restore the monarchy of Russia as part of the reawakened Mongol Khanate. Ungern dressed in Mongol-style clothing and rode a white horse as it conformed to prophecies of a savior Khan. He may also have bribed local lamas to further this identification among the people. Ossendowski describes meeting the man face to face, noting his
steely, sharp eyes. These eyes were fixed upon me like those of an animal from a cave. My observations lasted but for a flash, but I understood that before me was a very dangerous man, ready for an instant spring into irrevocable action.
The Baron speaks.
Now, I shall tell you about myself, who and what I am. My name is surrounded with such hate and fear that no one can judge what is the truth and what is false, what is history and what myth. Sometime you will write about it, remembering your trip through Mongolia and your sojourn at the yurt of the Bloody General.
Or, more commonly, the Bloody Baron. You also find him referred to as the Mad Baron. And as Conrad would have said, some of the Baron's methods were unsound. Men who failed him were subject to 100 strokes of a bamboo cane for minor infractions. Others, not conforming to his rigorous standards, were forced to spend the night clinging to treetops or abandoned on frozen rivers subject to the predations of wolves, or stripped naked and made to subsist on a diet of raw meat for days. Traitors or spies would be shot, buried alive, crucified with nails, or tied to trees and burned. Much of Ungern's efforts revolved around the Mongolian capital of Urga, then held by the Chinese. An initial foray was routed, but the Baron's fierceness and prophetic mystique allowed him to later rally 10,000 Mongolian volunteers who returned to drive out the Chinese. But as the Red Army approached to take Urga for themselves, Ossendowski has the Baron foreseeing his own doom.
I shall die, but no matter, no matter. The cause has been launched and will not die. I know the roads this cause will travel. The tribes of Genghis Khan's successors are awakened.
The Reds succeeded in capturing Urga. The Baron fled into Siberia, but his exhausted men betrayed him to the communists, and he was executed. It's worth mentioning that Ungern's willingness to be seen as the fulfillment of an ancient Buddhist prophecy is not without precedent. Siberian-born Tibetan monk Agvan Lobsang Dorsev, a tutor of the 13th Dalai Lama and diplomatic envoy between Tibet and Russia, attempted to boost support of the former for the latter with a pamphlet printed in 1909. In it, he compared the Romanov emperor with the king of Shambhala, a mythical city of Buddhist myth, roughly comparable to Agartha, though not usually imagined as subterranean. According to the Japanese Buddhist monk Akai Kawaguchi, in his 1909 volume, 3 Years in Tibet, Dorsai's
artful scheme that has been crowned with great success. For today, almost every Tibetan blindly believes in the ingenious story and holds that the Tsar will sooner or later subdue the whole world and found a gigantic Buddhist empire.
Now we come to a figure who represents a sort of nexus of all we've discussed, Alexander Bodchenko, an occult researcher of the 1920s who inspired high-ranking Soviet officials with his talk about Agartha, Shambhala, Hyperborea, and even the concept of synarchy. Bodchenko's early interest in biology took a turn for the esoteric when he dropped out of medical studies, purportedly traveled to India, and ended up studying what would later be called ESP, conducting his own experiments involving subjects with shaved heads and metal skull caps, attempting to send thoughts through copper wires. And he worked as a fortune teller, a popular science writer, and novelist, devoting several novels to the adventures of a mysterious doctor who hobnobbed with members of a secret society of Shambhala, or Shambhala Agartha, as he often referred to it, considering them both appropriate names for the same preserve of ancient Hyperborean superscience and religion. During the Civil War, Bodchenko also earned his ration card through the Navy by providing educational lectures aboard the ships of the St. Petersburg fleet. That the sailors were being regaled with possibly counter-revolutionary tales of Shambhala soon brought Bodchenko to the attention of the secret police, the Cheka. But the self-proclaimed professor was well prepared for this meeting. Comparing it to communism, he enthused over the idea of synarchy as a path through the anarchy of the Civil War. Of greater interest to his interrogators, however, was the idea that the ancient knowledge of Shambhala Agartha could be mined for new techniques of psychic control, surveillance, and manipulation. The early days of the revolution until Stalin's Great Purge of 1938 was actually a boom time for esoteric research in Russia, always with this eye toward practical advantages offered the state, of course. Particularly interested in this new frontier, and what Bodchenko had to say was the cryptographer-in-chief of the secret police, Gleb Boki. He also happened to preside over a lab dedicated to experiments in hypnotism, telepathy, and means of altering human consciousness. His extracurricular interests were broader still, embracing theosophy and the teachings of visiting Tibetan lamas. Rumors also swirl around his summer cottage, said to be the site of drunken revels, nude frolics, wife-swapping, and tantric orgies. Supported by Boki, Bodchenko experimented with telepathy and astral projection as a means to contact the masters of Shambhala, Agartha. But when this proved unsatisfactory, he petitioned for a state-funded expedition to find the mythical kingdom. While this did not happen, Bodchenko was granted a key position in another unusual expedition, one organized in 1922 by the Intelligence and State Security Service, under which the secret police operated. The destination was the Kola Peninsula, a remote area in northwest Russia bordering Finland and Norway. The Kola tundra region is home to the nomadic Sami, and their reindeer herds. The phenomenon which Barchenko was to investigate was an outbreak of a collective psychological syndrome known locally as Ahnenerbe, a suggestible trance-like state peculiar to Arctic regions. It's also called Arctic hysteria, Piplop talk among the Inuit, or most colorfully, the call of the polar star. Ethnographer Vaclav Serashevsky, in his 1896 book Yakuts, named for the people of northeastern Siberia who also are thus afflicted, writes about the condition.
The sufferer wails, shouts, sniffles, tells incredible tales, while also breaking down and being thrown about the place until completely drained, they fall asleep.
Barchenko, in his report on the expedition, comments on this repetition of others' words as well as actions, writing,
If someone in the presence of the sufferer were to jump or hit themselves, they would do the same. They can smash a dearly valued item, or even let go of a baby in their arms. If someone in front of them were to perform the action of throwing, researchers would note. Meanwhile, if one were to try and limit the actions of the afflicted person, they would sink into a raucous state, demonstrating unusual physical strength. There is plenty of evidence of cases where several adult men would not be able to restrain a teenager during an episode.
A February 19th, 1923 edition of the St. Petersburg paper, the Red Gazette, breathlessly reported on the expedition, describing Barchenko as a professor who had
discovered the remains of ancient cultures dating back to a period older than the era of the birth of Egyptian civilization.
Remains of this Hyperborean civilization, according to Barchenko, are still revered.
To this day, the Lapps of Russian Lapland revere the remains of prehistoric religious centers. The expedition managed to discover the remains of one of these religious centers, the sacred lake Sayed, a lake with the remains of colossal sacred images.
He then goes on to reference
half-collapsed underground passages, trenches that protected the approaches to the sacred lake. The local Lapps are extremely unfriendly to attempts to more thoroughly examine interesting monuments. They refused to give the expedition a boat, warning that approaching the sculptures would bring all sorts of misfortunes on our and their heads.
The sculpture probably references a huge, eroded, discolored cliffside marking referred to by the Sami as the Old Man, a mythic nemesis of their people. Barchenko's friend, the astronomer and astrologer Alexander Kondian, who accompanied the expedition, mentioned this figure in his presentation to the geographical section of the World Studies Society, comparing its posture to that of a Hindu yogi. In his astronomical diary, he also comments on what seems to be a prehistoric road, saying,
It even seems that it is paved. At the end of the road, there is a small elevation. Everything suggests that in ancient times, this grove was a protected area, and the elevation at the end of the road served as an altar sacrificial place in front of the old man.
As you might have guessed, skeptics have suggested more mundane explanations for the formations Barchenko and Kondian referred to as Hyperborean. Over the next years, Barchenko, with Boki's support, also made trips to the Altai Mountains to investigate shamanic activity. The hypnotic effects of drumming were of particular interest to Boki, and the two even confiscated ancient drums from ethnographic museums for experiments in their Moscow lab. In the Siberian Altai, Barchenko also visited communities of Old Believers, an isolationist sect of the Russian Orthodox Church, who preserved legends of the Chud, fairy-like beings who along with the Slavs and Varangians, were the mythic founders of Russia. Hostilities in ancient times were supposed to have driven the Chud into a subterranean sanctuary from which they only emerge when great peril confronts the surface world. Barchenka found in this a parallel to Agartha or Shambhala, as he did also in the Old Believers' tales of a utopian Neverland known as Mythivodia, the land of white waters. Sadly, the time of such freewheeling esoteric explorations came to an end under Stalin, as I mentioned, and during the Great Purge, the activities of Barchenka, Boki, and Kondain were deemed counter-revolutionary, and they, along with countless others, were interrogated under torture, producing confessions that led to their executions in 1937. The last Russian we'll discuss is from the same era and seems to have been the most successful in combining Shambhala mysticism with political maneuvers, Nicholas Roerich. He's best known as a painter of glowing Himalaya landscapes and spiritually charged scenes from Asian and Russian mythology. He's much better known in Russia, but his work does crop up in the US on the covers of New Age books and related contexts. He was also a writer on esoteric topics, a theosophist, and with his wife Helena started a metaphysical movement, Rurichism, which still has members today, mostly in Russia. His reputation was such that in 1913, Igor Stravinsky called on him to design costumes and sets for the premiere production of The Rite of Spring. It was through his wife that Roerich became interested in Eastern religion and theosophy. Helena was supposed to have been a gifted psychic capable of telepathic communication with Mahatma Maurya, one of theosophy's hidden masters of ancient wisdom. Thus guided in 1920, the couple founded their own metaphysical school, Agni Yoga, which later, along with more utopian political beliefs, gave birth to Rurichism. Like many Russians at the beginning of the 20th century, Rurich believed that his nation was poised to fulfill a special destiny. However, his thinking was inherently visionary and hardly in line with the Bolshevik program. In 1918, the couple left Russia for Finland, later living in Britain, the United States, and finally India. All the while, Rurich retained a certain native allegiance and was not above stirring the pot in his homeland if it seemed helpful to his grand vision. And that vision was grand indeed. Psychic transmission via Helena had informed him of what was called
The Great Plan,
in which Rurich would play a pivotal role, as would the king of Shambhala, whom Rurich identified as the Maitreya, the future Buddha who would lead a final battle against the forces of evil and then establish a sort of terrestrial Shambhala, uniting Europe's eastern neighbor, Russia, and Russian Central Asian interests with South and East Asia. The kingdom's capital, Rurich believed, would be built in southern Siberia at the foot of Mount Beluga, the highest peak of the Altai Mountains, a location already associated in legend with entrance to the Shambhala of Tibetan Buddhism or the Old Believers' fairyland, Mythivodia. There are also legends that subterranean passages entered under this mountain lead all the way to Tibet. The Rurichs were adventuresome travelers, and Nicholas documented journeys to these regions of metaphysical and mythological interest in his 1929 book, Altai Himalayas. Roerich also documented these travels in paintings, producing during the trip and in the ensuing decades 2,000 Himalayan pictures. Because his journey coincided with the Great Game, the Roerich's movement through these territories attracted the attention of both Russian and British intelligence, as well as that of the US and Japan. Despite his expatriate status, Roerich was apparently still well enough connected in his homeland to petition the Soviets for assistance. He received some logistical support and thereby raised suspicions that he may have reciprocated by providing the Soviets with valuable intelligence. Unsurprisingly, he had little success in selling the Russians on his great plan fantasy, so Hardnet. As extra insurance during his travels, he let it be known, wherever it should prove useful, that Helena's psychic friend Moria had identified him as the 5th Dalai Lama, and he had a mole pattern on his cheek to prove it. Roerich is cagey in his Altai Himalayas about finding Shambhala. He's told by an equally cagey Lama that it exists purely in the spiritual realm, but argues the point, saying that he and his group along the way have heard stories to the contrary.
We know how some high lamas went to Shambhala, how along their way they saw the customary physical things. We know the stories of the Buryat Lama, of how he was accompanied through a very narrow secret passage. We know how another visitor saw a caravan of hill people with salt from the lakes on the very borders of Shambhala. Moreover, we ourselves have seen a white frontier post one of the 3 outposts of Shambhala.
Where are these posts? He doesn't say. Instead, he provides a catalog of parallel myths, stories from various cultures describing supernatural underworld kingdoms, saying,
You begin to grasp the peculiar coincidence in these manifold legends, related by peoples who are even ignorant of each other's names. Each entrance to a cave suggests that someone has already entered there. Every creek, especially the subterranean creeks, draw one's fantasy to the underground passages. In many places of Central Asia, they speak of the Agartha, the subterranean people. In numerous beautiful legends, they outline the same story of how the best people abandoned the treacherous earth and sought salvation in hidden countries where they acquired new forces and conquered powerful energies.
It's unknown. Despite all this hand-waving, Roerich was supposed to have possessed a physical token coming from Shambhala, a stone. This is often referred to as the Chintanami stone, a name taken from Buddhist myth describing a precious wish-granting jewel or pearl that fell from the sky. In Roerich's prose, the object is compared to the Chintanami, if not exactly identified as such. The precious object, which was said to have come into the couple's possession in 1923, is alluded to in his writing under different names, often just called
the Black Stone,
or
the Treasure of the World,
or sometimes
the Gift of Orion.
This being the constellation associated with its fall from space. Roerich also likened it to the Philosopher's Stone and the Holy Grail, and mentions it passing to King Solomon, who split the stone to make a ring, to Muhammad, to Alexander the Great, the Mughal Emperor Akbar, and so on. He also mentions it being found by an Atlantean king shortly after its fall. In his 1947 book, Himalayas, Abode of Light, he writes,
Since those times, a part of the stone has been traveling on Earth, signaling the new era and great world events. Many wonderful things have been told by educated Buryats and Mongols of the miraculous stone coming from a far star, which is appearing in different places before great events. The chief body of this stone is lying in Shambhala, and a small piece of it is given out and wanders all over the earth, keeping magnetic connection with the main stone.
It's worth noting that this passage from the late 1940s is as explicit as Rurich's writing ever gets about the topic. It's not really spelled out in Altai Himalayas or in his other books, but his followers believe that the stone traveled with their teacher on journeys to Shambhala-adjacent regions, providing spiritual strength and protection en route. It's also suggested that the fragments need to be joined with the mother stone in Shambhala was the true purpose of these journeys. However this may be, the symbolic stone of Rurich's ethereal prose is elsewhere represented as a solid, very literal reality. According to Helena's diary, it arrived in a parcel delivered to the couple on October 6, 1923, while they were staying at the Lord Byron Hotel in Paris. She wrote,
The parcel was a white wooden box with an address written in red ink in French by some bold hand.
The package contained no letter, as the sender presumed the object would be recognized. It was delivered by a messenger of the Bankers' Trust in Paris, where it had been deposited and released to the Rurichs by an anonymous third party, a certain secret sect in France, as the tradition goes. Contained in the parcel was an antique casket covered in tooled leather. Within was a black stone wrapped in an embroidered cloth. Well, surprisingly, there's a newspaper photo of the stone that circulated widely in Russia at one point. The available black and white version is of low quality, but the cloth on which it lies matches that of a cloth kept in the Rurich Museum in Moscow. I don't know that it's on public display, but photos of the cloth, the casket, and even the delivery box in which it arrived are available. The casket is also featured in a couple of paintings by Rurich's son, one a portrait of his father dressed as a lama holding this casket. The provenance of these items has certainly been questioned by skeptics. It's even been suggested that the stone, the cloth, the casket were all put together by the Rurichs themselves as a means of strengthening their supernatural standing among the inner circle. For all the beautiful art and noble words, and whatever might have been sincerely believed, it's also not hard to see the Rurichs as wily grifters. I won't go into all the unpleasant details and lawsuits, but it's worth mentioning a somewhat similar incident from a 1926 visit to Moscow, during which Rurich attempted to promote his great plan and presented Soviet Minister Chicherin with a handful of dirt to be laid on Lenin's grave. It was supposedly taken from the grave of a great Tibetan Mahatma and emissary to Shambhala, but the burial site mentioned in records was a location never found on any map, so there are questions. And there are also questions about the Black Stone itself. After the death of Nicholas and Helena's son in 1993, it mysteriously disappeared, which could be the start of a Buddhist Dan Brown series, perhaps? What you're hearing is from a video on YouTube posted on March 3rd, 2011. It's titled, in Russian,
Rumble from the Cave of Spirits.
And the description:
The earth is calling. A very interesting hum similar to the performance of a mantra appeared on February 25th, 2011 in the Cave of Spirits in Tibet. The cave itself is a whole labyrinth, and in one passage it leads to a dead end, where there is a crack going deep down. That's where the sound was recorded. Previously, in ancient times, they heard something similar and called it the chanting of the Shiva mantra. According to local legends and beliefs, the half-god Shiva remained to protect the half-gods while they were in hibernation until the advent of a new century.
Make of it what you will, but it seemed an appropriate way to end our show. Or not quite end, because there's more. The strange thing is, sound anomalies were appearing all over the world in 2011 and 12. A playlist I found called The Earth is Groaning brought this to my attention. It compiles strange sounds recorded in Ukraine, in Brazil, Germany, Swiss sounds, and Belgian sounds, among others. Stranger still are more recent sounds that seem to issue from within a Chinese mountain in Guizhou province. And I will close with this recording from July 2020.
Super scary sound emitting from a mountain in Guizhou, China for more than 10 days. Many people are looking for the reason, but nobody can find the source of this horrible sound. Experts from Beijing also came to do research. However, so far no one knows where the sound came from. Some say this is called earthly dragon sound, warning about some kind of disaster like earthquake, volcano, flood. Some say the Bible also mentioned this sound. This is a signal warning that catastrophe is coming. Many say this is the sound of the people who died under the Chinese Communist Party dictatorship. In the last 70 years, the CCP has killed many innocent people. This is the sound from the hell. The gate of the hell is opening to pull the CCP down. All these opinions have one thing in common, warning about coming disaster. Coincidentally, on the 2nd of July, an earthquake of 4.5 Richter happened exactly at the place where the sound located. The CCP has to pay for its evil crime. Heaven is punishing it. Everyone should not stand with it, otherwise you will get the same result with it.
I hope everyone's been enjoying our show, and if so, that you'd leave us a review to boost our visibility. We've added a link to walk you through that process on our website. You can find it via the reviews menu, or even better, join us on Patreon as a supporter. Among the many reward tiers available, a monthly pledge of $2 provides you immediate access to posts on our show blog in which I share curious tidbits from history, folklore, and films related to our general subject matter. Donating a mere $4 or more monthly brings you an extra episode every month, one similar to what you've just heard, but a bit shorter. I should also mention that when you access the blog and bonus episodes, it's not just the material from the current month we're talking about. There's a long archive stretching back to 2018 with content you can immediately enjoy. Other rewards include downloads of those show soundscapes heard under the narration, the show scripts, my Krampus book, various t-shirt and mug options, and unique hand-packed mystery kits. Bone and Sickle is written and produced by me, Al Reitenauer. Mrs. Carswell is played by Sarah Chavez, whose children's book, We Need to Talk About Death, can be found on Amazon and in stores near you. Thanks so much for listening.